looking for EV batteries work areas over the past how many months? I don't know, over a year, from April 2023. So let me begin the webinar now. Let's actually introduce one another in the chat if you can. Please let us know what your name is, what your organization is, and where you're joining from. And if you want to add any message about your interest in learning about EV battery issues, you can add a message as well. So I'll give you some moments to put some messages into the chat. But if you're feeling shy, that's totally fine. So in the meantime, I need to look at this screen. Sorry. Let me introduce the idea of doing this webinar today. So the goal is to share what GAIA has been doing on EV battery issues, and why we are doing this, and what we have learned from different regions, as well as the global level initiatives, and what our strategies and plans moving forward. So today's program is that I'm gonna do a quick introduction of GAIA's EV battery team, and we are having 4 presentations today, including mine on the overview of battery end-of-life issues, and 3 regional perspectives presentations done by Kenza, Mayang, and Aline. And we'll have a Q&A session after the 3 regional presentations, and then closing. And I wanted to make a note that interpretation is available in French. You're supposed to click on the globe icon at the bottom, and you can choose the French option if you feel more comfortable with French. Special thanks to our support team, Trish, Desmond, and Corinne. Thank you for supporting the webinar today. We appreciate all your help. So let me begin with introducing GAIA's new batteries team. It's been a year to work in this team, consisting of 5 regions and the global support team. So today we are joined by 3 regional leads, Aline for Europe, Kenza for Africa, and Jeff and Mayang for Asia Pacific. And I wanted to just quickly make a point about why we are looking at battery waste issues, and especially why we are looking at electric vehicle batteries among all other large format batteries. So to break free from fossil fuel reliant society, we need batteries to store energy and make the electric vehicles run, right? So battery is an essential part of the energy transition, and we're noticing that there's a distinct threat coming from the growing number of EV battery waste. So in about 6 years, we are seeing more than 1 million EV batteries retiring and becoming waste, and the number will keep growing. And by 2050, we're expecting to see 50 million waste batteries, EV batteries. And at the end of life, they can present hazards. And I'm gonna explain more about why we need to prioritize repair, reuse, and repurposing over recycling or disposal in the following presentations. So last year, what we have done, mainly research and member consultations and strategy development. I'm not going to go into the detail, but I'm really excited to present what we have learned through our research efforts from last year today. And through the member engagement program, we have consulted over 150 organizations. And I'm sure some of you might have been part of that consultation process. And among many strategies that we built for EV batteries, the one we wanted to highlight is the zero-waste hierarchy for EV batteries, which I will be introducing at a later stage of the presentation. So this is the part where I begin my actual presentation. I'm filling in for Jeff's position for facilitation, and I'll be doing my best to make it short and compact. Yeah, so what are EV batteries that we are talking about? So I want you to look at the image in the middle, which is a battery cell. And to build a battery cell, you need critical minerals such as lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And there are some fluoropolymers like PFAS, the forever chemicals, used throughout the battery structure. And you put together lots of battery cells to make a battery module in the right side, and you group battery modules to make a battery pack, which is the final form of EV battery that you see in a vehicle. And for a Tesla car, for example, you need about 7,000 battery cells. So you can imagine the scale of mineral needs to run this system. So the batteries are used in different types of electric vehicles, including some cars, buses, trucks, scooters, bikes, and jeepneys in the Philippines, forklifts, etc., etc. And what we are concerned about is that the battery market is constantly evolving, but without recyclability or repairability in mind. So it used to be lead-acid batteries used in hybrid cars before, and we are seeing most of the time lithium-ion batteries in EVs now, and there's some emerging alternatives that are not reliant on lithium and other critical minerals. But the problem is that they are not built to be easily recyclable. So, we are keen to see what comes next and how to make sure that they are sustainable at the end of life. So what's happening at the end of life of these EV batteries? So they are taken out of a car when they reach the capacity of 70 or 80%, and they are not being recycled that much. It's because they are not designed with circularity in mind. It's really difficult to disassemble the battery packs. And another issue is that because everything is just really new, we are not seeing huge surges in the number of waste batteries as of now. So the market is kind of small, and it's called the Wild West. And it's understood that only less than 5% of EV batteries are being recycled. So I brought 3 concerns today for my presentation. The first one is pollution coming out of the end-of-life facilities. Let me begin with this community victory case from New York in the United States, where local residents fought back a proposal for a battery incinerator by Sungil High Tech. And what they were able to do is to reveal the fact that the company might release some PFAS chemicals. And through this process, they were able to change the law that allowed the construction, that would have allowed the construction of the facility. So we are celebrating this as a major win. And why were the residents so concerned of the battery incinerator or the pyrometallurgy facility? Is here. So when you burn batteries at such high temperature, you don't really recover. And of course,
That's what I might be able easily to find.
Sorry, John, can you? Yes, thank you. So with the high heat, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions is a concern, and there's toxic emissions coming out of the process, and it's posing risks to workers and nearby community members. And we are doing research on different recycling methods, including hydrometallurgy, which is acid leaching, and pyrometallurgy, which is battery burning. And while there's a lot to be understood, we are now seeing that the battery recycling happens in these 3 steps. So first, you have to take the spent batteries and shred them, first discharge them and shred them into powder. And you either burn that or put in some acidic solvents to extract the metals, and then you do the end product preparation. And the part we are doing research on now is whether the thermal processing is a must for hydrometallurgy, the acid leaching process, or not. And we're going to share more research findings as we learn more. So recycling is difficult for EV batteries, and I am pointing out the 5 main barriers here. From design, the collection is also expensive and messy. The recycling processes are a little bit questionable, and well, not a little bit, but it's questionable. And the costs are high, and there's a lack of policy, which is a major barrier as well. So let's go to the second concern. The second category is that the batteries are not built to be repairable. So it's very challenging to get any EV batteries fixed, repaired, because the failures most of the time occur at module level, and there's only a few specialized centers who can deal with such batteries. It can be very expensive, even if technically it's possible to get batteries repaired. And also, sometimes it's just simply impossible when the companies design the batteries to be shutting down when somebody tries to open it. And also, nowadays, battery makers, manufacturers make cell-to-pack or cell-to-body types of batteries, which are even harder to disassemble and to repair. So concern number 3 is about waste colonialism and waste flows. So we are concerned that used electric vehicle exports can cause public health hazards in the receiving country. We know what happened with low-grade plastic waste, which polluted the environment and people's lives in the receiving countries, mainly in the global south countries. So there are risks for waste pickers and workers and community members, and there's some risks for fires and explosions. And another concern is the lack of regulation and transparency, which can worsen the situation. But luckily or not luckily, we are not actually seeing that trend now, because the number of batteries taken out of the car is relatively small at the moment, but we are keen to monitor any cross-border movements of the used EVs and EV batteries. All right, so this is the highlight of our strategy for EV waste battery, EV battery waste. So as with any other waste streams, we want to approach the EV battery waste problem with this hierarchy in mind. So starting from refuse and rethink, and going to reduce, repair, reuse, repurpose, and then we can consider some form of recycling. when all the upstream approaches are tried, right? And then at the bottom, what we are categorizing as unacceptable is, of course, burning batteries of all kinds. A little bit of details on repair and reuse, refurbish. So we are calling for some design initiatives to make sure that batteries are designed in repairability in mind. And there's so much potential for battery second life applications. They can be reused for electricity storage and for other vehicles and as spare parts. We need to maximize that potential. And also it's important to increase the transparency around the battery history and health information. And refurbishing batteries so that they can function for the original functionality would be important. I explained the second life applications here. And again, the transparency plays a big role, which can be enhanced through labeling systems such as battery passport. And I can explain a little bit more about the battery passport later here. So at the global level, I just wanted to give a quick overview of some policy and partnership and other initiatives. So at the UN level, we have an ongoing process at the Basel Convention where there's draft guidelines being built on non-lead acid batteries. And we've submitted comments to the UN Special Rapporteur report on the risks of pyrometallurgy of EV batteries. And the Global Battery Alliance is a public-private partnership working on a battery passport that can increase the transparency throughout the battery value chain. So we are monitoring their initiative as well as being participating in their progress. And Lead the Charge is our partner who is ranking car companies, and we are building a set of criteria on end-of-life issues. And we work in solidarity with Third Coalition, which is a coalition formed by indigenous groups to hold mining companies accountable. I think that's about it for my overview presentation. And let me invite Kenza for the African perspectives of the EV battery issues.
Hello, everyone. I was wondering if you were going to keep your screen on or not. So great. Let me just do this quickly. I just want to make check with the interpreters that you can hear me well. Okay, and everyone can see my screen, hopefully. All right, so as June was saying, we started this project about a year ago, and we have been slowly doing more and more research to know what is going on. And then, so in the beginning of everything, when we looked at, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna skip over all of your. When we looked at the end of life of batteries and the market of EVs and everything, what we could see was that Africa wasn't a big player when it comes to manufacturing, but it was a big player when it came to mining. So as June might have mentioned, batteries rely heavily on certain minerals, and that's what usually comes from Africa, and that's what Africa represents for the EV supply chain. So for example, in terms of numbers, what that means is when you look at the supply chain, and if you get all the way to the end where you actually have electric vehicles, we're looking at $7 trillion, while Africa's focus is on mining and metals, and that's about an $11 billion. And I have to be honest and say that I do not understand these numbers. They're simply too big for me to comprehend. But I can tell that it's like a lot smaller than, especially for a continent that produces most of the minerals. So we kept on doing some research, and then we had consultations with our members during our last regional meeting. So some of you I can see are on the call already. So we had about 25 GAIA members consulted from 15 countries. We spoke a lot about, for example, the minerals coming from the DRC, like 70% of the world's cobalt. We spoke about how the term energy transition does not necessarily apply to some countries in Africa, because we do not have some of our countries in Africa are not industrialized for us to have had this transition from, for example, coal powered or fossil fuels in a large scale. Now, I don't mean I mean in the same scale as it would be in the global north. I know that all of the countries have an electric grid, but we do not consume as much electricity as the global north, for example. So we also spoke about what our priorities as a region would be. And then we want to prevent waste dumping. We want to develop EPR, enable second life applications of used EV batteries, address full cycle of impacts. And I'm just going to go through a few takeaways from the regional meeting. And then we said that we still need to define and clarify the strategy. We do not know what the end of life consequences are when it comes to batteries, and this is something we're also looking at. I like the quote that we have been absent from conversations, and this is why we bear the burden. And this is an opportunity for us to be there from the beginning. We won't only have to deal with the consequences, we will bring solutions. And what do we mean by the burden and the consequences? Often we've seen that Africa is subject to waste colonialism, what we call waste colonialism, and that means exports of or imports to the continent of waste from other countries. We have most of the countries in Africa's car fleet, for example, is secondhand cars. And so we usually get things secondhand, and they end up dying or at their end of life on the continent. If not, sometimes we just get pure waste, such as e-waste, textile waste, and even car waste. So one of our areas of focus as a region would be waste colonialism, strengthening international conventions such as the Bamako and Basel Convention to take into consideration this new stream of waste. And we will see later how why we call it a new stream of waste. Waste management throughout the life cycle as well of the batteries. EPR, the manufacturer takes responsibility for batteries that they make, and then recycling health hazards, as well as providing solutions and alternatives. So these were our focus areas as we decided as members on the continent. So I want to move on to what has happened a little bit after. And I am doing further research to see what is going on in terms of e-mobility policies. Now, it's very interesting because we started as a team, we started looking at electric vehicle batteries. And then we realized that often it's not only electric vehicle batteries, but it's also energy storage batteries. But for the purposes of this, of my research, I needed to narrow down what I need to be looking at. Am I looking at lithium ion batteries? Am I looking at e-mobility policies? Am I looking at energy storage? And they often overlay, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about e-mobility policies. And I'm currently attending a workshop by UNEP on e-mobility in Africa, and I will talk a little bit later about that. So during my research, I could think of about 4 categories of countries. One, you have the countries with automotive industry, like Morocco, South Africa, Nigeria to a certain extent. The interesting part here is these countries do not necessarily have e-mobility policies for their local market. I mean, there are some incentives to like hybrid cars, to buying hybrid cars, some electric cars, but their industry is rapidly shifting to build EVs or electric vehicles because they're usually selling cars to other countries that actually want to change their fleet. So, for example, Morocco manufactures some cars for Europe for certain brands, and then because Europe is moving towards 100%, well, at least 50% by 2030, I believe, of the fleet, or 2050 of the fleet to be electric cars. So I'm based in Morocco, so I know that we are building gigafactories to make batteries for these cars. Then you have countries with e-mobility policies for mass transit vehicles, and those are countries like Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Seychelles, Mauritius, Tanzania, South Africa, and these are policies started by cities for their buses and minivan as a way to transport population and make their mass transit more green and more eco-friendly. Now, of course, when we talk about these terms, we always have to remember that the vehicles themselves might be electric, but the charging and the where the electricity come from isn't always as eco-friendly or as green as we would like it to be. Then we have also countries with e-mobility policies for 2- and 3-wheelers. We're talking about motorcycles, of course, and what we call tuk-tuks, I guess, in Asia. So Ethiopia, Togo, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Madagascar, Sierra Leone, Tanzania have policies in place to encourage the electrification of 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. Also, countries with e-mobility policies for light-duty EVs, Ghana, Mauritius, Mozambique, Tunisia, Côte d'Ivoire, Zambia. So I just wanted to also point out that now these are policies for e-mobility. When it comes to waste management, the policies are not clear enough, and the interesting part is that when you talk about end of life of batteries, you are talking about at least 3 or 4 ministries coming together. You're talking about Ministry of Transportation, Environment. Sometimes the waste management is under the Ministry of Interior. And so because some countries have, for example, extensive legislation on e-waste, such as Ghana. However, now with EV batteries, that is different because it's a new stream of waste that we anticipate coming in heavily in the next few years. But how do we do them? But how do we treat that, and how do we legislate for that? So if you look at throughout policies in the continent, sometimes they're still considered either under laws legislating e-waste or laws regulating hazardous waste, or just sometimes they're still under solid waste in certain countries. So we don't have clear legislation when it comes to batteries. UNEP has an e-mobility program, and this is the workshop I'm currently attending. I think what I have been hearing throughout yesterday and today is, so the workshop that I'm attending has governments, but also industry and some CSOs participating. It seems like the governments are also worried about waste colonialism because they're very aware that, well, first of all, lots of the fleets in the countries, in African countries, are of imported cars. Now, what happens when these cars that are imported are used EVs? So what is the infrastructure that will be required in terms of charging the cars, for example, and the prices and all of this? There's been a lot of talk also about end-of-life management of batteries, and lots of talk about implementing what June mentioned, like battery passports, but also transfer of knowledge and transfer of capacity in order for local recyclers on the continent to be able to do I guess, safe recycling on the continent. And then yes, Desmond, sorry, I will be wrapping up very soon. But also, there's been lots of calls for, now because we have cars and batteries coming in from China, from Europe, from, well, the US, not so much in Africa. We need to work with manufacturers and at the design level for repairability of the batteries. We also see lots of reuse and repurposing being done, especially, for example, in South Africa with the energy crisis, where some EV batteries are being reused for energy storage in homes. So there is a lot of potential for reuse and repurpose, also repair, but as long as manufacturers disclose of and transfer the knowledge to do so to mechanics and people in Africa. And so this is what the governments are saying and what UNEP is working on currently. Yes, I think that would be it for my presentation. I apologize in advance. I will have to go back to the UNEP workshop. If any questions, maybe Trish or Desmond, you can write me on Slack and I'll come back, but I can't keep both sounds on, I realized. But thank you, everyone. And I will pass the floor to Mayang.
Good luck to the workshop. Hi, I'm Mayang Azurin from GAIA Asia Pacific. And actually, Kenza, it will be easier for me to present this regional context because Kenza already discussed some elements like waste colonialism, the difference of the context of the North with the southern countries, which I think a region like us is considered, still many of the countries is considered to be part of the global South. So when we speak of Asia Pacific, it's so diverse that it's hard to say this is what's happening in the region. But what we can say, this presentation will show is the significance of each sub-region, like or huge players in the region and their impact on our work in zero waste and batteries. Next. And just cut me if I'm taking up too long. So when we speak of Asia Pacific and EV batteries or batteries in general, we have to remember that one region, China, has dominance in the entire EV supply chain, but dependent on the importation for lithium. So there's a number of raw materials needed for EV batteries, but there's one that China doesn't have control. When we say one player is in control of the EV supply chain, it can dictate the technology, it can dictate how materials will be recovered, the pace of research and development, the pace of where the shaping of the market and partnerships around it. So it's quite hard when one player has a regional or dominance in the entire supply chain. But there are also important players in the region with homegrown automotive industry, like South Korea and Japan, which account for 70% of the world's battery production and market. So in the AP team, we have consulted, I think last year, we have consulted 25 organizations from 5 countries. We did a lot of listening. We did teach-in webinars. We reviewed literatures. We attended convenings of industries, meetings in international financial institutions to know what's happening on EV battery. And the other trend is that, but in India, we said China, South Korea, and Japan, but India is not going to want to be at the far end of the game. So India also has its own homegrown industry, automotive industry, and they want to shift to EV. They're growing fast and progressing on that capacity because a lot of workers and their markets will die if they don't shift right away. So they're developing its capacity for manufacturing and recycling of EV batteries by increasing and incentivizing recycling capacity. Recently, they have revised the solid waste management 2022 rules to do that, incentivize recycling capacity. And they are poised to become a leader in end-of-life management for EV. Currently, they have just recently locked a deal with European Union for recycling of minerals and minerals in the EV battery. So they're doing that. But Southeast Asia has a different story because Southeast Asia mostly have control of most of the raw materials, but they don't have homegrown industries. So now we're seeing a lot of progress. We've seen industry roadmaps on EV sprouting in Southeast Asia because they realized that, hey, we have the raw materials that the North needs, that the rich countries need, but we're not developing our own industry. This is our time. So most policies in Southeast Asia involve rebate, subsidy schemes, and now they're doing that, as I've said, an industry-wide development. And but there's problems in that. We can see that in an industrial policy side, but there's problem in that if there's no recycling or recovering of materials or infrastructure in place, because each stage of the recycling or the raw material, the battery life cycle it's just transition issues or justice issues, which I will discuss later on. But what are the drivers for expansion of EV vehicles in the region? Next, and I will be very fast. Sorry. Next slide. And this slide is important because we want to know the insights or the motives of governments, of certain players in the EV battery or EV per se. So this is on top of the agenda when we're looking at or engaging in climate spaces, reducing the carbon footprint of transport, improving air quality and noise pollution, reduced energy usage. So one driver is also less dependency on fossil fuel imports and external price shocks. This is very important when there's geopolitical issues right now where oil transports and fossil fuels are becoming, are trying to be reduced. And at the same time, it's not accessible to all because of the wars. So countries need to have reliance or control over this new form of energy. And then industrial policy, as I've mentioned, they want to develop comparative advantage and use the raw materials. So they're developing the industrial policy in EV, and then energy security. Who owns the raw materials and who controls the supply chain are important questions in terms of who owns lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, and graphite. And eventually this redounds to energy security for a low carbon future. And as I've said, China produces 60% of some materials. 8 of the 25 nations supplying battery metals globally are in Asia Pacific. So that means a lot of extraction are happening in Asia Pacific, and that will have a lot of impact on in terms of manufacturing, etc. Next slide. EV, next slide, please. So EV and just transition. This is important when we want to see the issues around life cycle and what players, what issues, what players do we have to engage with. No, in every stage of the supply chain of the EV battery. Sorry, it's not just EV car, but the EV battery per se has a lot of justice issues, just like the plastics. No, so we're looking at it as from the extraction. There's mining for so-called transition minerals, and we're seeing a lot of mining in the mountains and even deep sea mining in the oceans. Indigenous peoples and ecosystem damages are in the forefront of the issue. The next is the raw material processing. Once the minerals are extracted, they are processed into cell component, and there's cell component production, and the same thing, there's ecosystem damage, and they're documented, for example, in Indonesia. And then poor working conditions of workers who are exposed in the processing and the community around the processing plants. There's also then, once they are produced, there's the battery cell pack production and the entire car and EV production. So now we're also looking into job losses. When we speak of transitioning from EV, from automobile, the traditional combustion engine, and to electric vehicles, millions will be affected by the transition. And that's happening. We're seeing that in the Philippines, displacements in Japan, workers who have been producing parts and bodies of the parts of the combustion engine, drivers of public utility with traditional combustion engines. And then there are poor working conditions in the cell pack production. And sometimes the shift is top-down without top-down approaches, like they don't discuss or have dialogues with those who will be impacted by the transition. Then the next is the redesign, reuse, and recycle. Recycling includes, as mentioned by Dun, it includes hydrometallurgy, pyrometallurgy, and biometallurgy, things that don't really grasp. No, the discussions are still nebulous, that this is good, this is bad, and we're still discovering which one is really the good, and which ones are the false solutions. But what we know is that these recycling includes human toxicity, ecotoxicity, occupational risks for informal recyclers. And in our field work, we have seen how waste pickers, for example, in the Philippines, are on the front line of collection. And because the EV battery, they do that in other e-waste, but EV battery is different. Because once they break the battery, then there's electricity inside. And there's a case where the waste picker he died because of the material exploded in front. He was electrocuted from recovering the material inside. And this is happening because there's just no industry guidelines. There's no training from government on how to recover, but the waste is already there. So the next slide, please. So what we're seeing, regional trends. Next slide, please. There's rising financing. So in the international financial institutions and there's industry spaces, there's rising financing on EV industry development as part of climate finance, yet little discussions on end-of-life management, including recovering materials and second life applications. So finance is rising, and interest despite the lack of financing for end-of-life management on recycling. And there's also growing recognition on the harms of recycling and second life app. And the next is the interest on second life apps due to rise of toxic landfills. As Kenza mentioned, some poor countries are beginning to see the inflow of, let's say, two-wheeler EVs, three-wheeler EVs, and conflicts on raw materials brought by geopolitical and security issues. Third, securing raw materials for battery production are driving recycling and these are led by China, Japan, South Korea, and India, countries with homegrown automotive industry. Fourth, trend is the recovery of materials from batteries are led by the informal recyclers and waste pickers, exposing them to various occupational hazards. Innovations are happening. Some startups, some innovative companies. How many minutes do I have? All right. Okay. Innovations are happening, but profits are low at the moment. And then fifth, there's just everywhere, even in countries with homegrown technologies, lack of technology on recycling and recovery of materials. There's just not the lack of technology, the infrastructure, investments, and policy are missing. The current methods are harmful and confidential. Pyrometallurgy methods are exported by Japan and hydro by China. And harms of various recycling methods, such as direct recycling, are increasingly documented. Potentials for treating some countries in the region as markets for low-grade EV vehicles and batteries, or landfills for spent EV cars and batteries are being seen. So even in the region, this is what we're have been observing, is that when we speak of Japan, China, and other countries, rich countries, they're speaking of cars. They're not speaking of the tricycles or the bikes. They're exported to poor countries in Southeast Asia countries. So when we speak of EV, there's different batteries and there's different policy issues around it. So that's also important to see. When we talk to the North, they're speaking of EV buses and EV trains. The low-grade cars are here. No low-grade cars. Low-grade EV vehicles, bicycles, trikes, and they have different issues. Who owns them, etc. What kinds of batteries are in them, and the waste that they produce. First, so this slide, priorities on our work in the region. Next slide. And I'm going faster. Next slide, please. All right. So based on this new readings, it has been 8 months, I think 8 months, readings and consultations and listening with other sectors. We have recasted our priorities on our work in the region. We saw that maybe we're not ready yet to campaign, despite the progress, the very fast-paced progress of EV in the policy agenda. So one, we see that we basically need to engage with media and policy for narrative building because it's already there. It's in the agenda. So we have to focus resource mobilization for this. Disparity of global north, and this is an opportunity to showcase or shape the narrative on the disparity of global north and global south, There are unaddressed historical issues, like Kenza said. We're not even talking about greening the sector. We're talking about there's a lot of populations that don't have electricity in the first place. Our grids, even if we have EVs, when we charge them, it's still fossil-based. Prices are still high. EVs are still well, no, EV cars are still expensive, but the low-grade vehicles that's what are accessible and being accessed by the poor because of the rising fossil fuel. There's so many issues, and these are just justice issues which are glossed over because of focused on technological issues, disparity of infrastructure, and this is an opportunity to open the justice issues, including waste colonialism. Second, opportunity to shape the narratives and policies along zero waste to pause and put in the front line affected communities for continued production of EVs, such as what mentioned by Dun. There's reduction, there's redesign, even before we talk of recycling. We are the resource of raw materials, and we don't want the same injustices as produced by other products in the same in Asia Pacific for other countries. So second, research on issues for electric battery system. There are a lot of questions we wanted to explore. So where the EV batteries are being sent. So we saw in our field work that there are some systems of collection in the shops where they are being sold, but we don't know where they are being sent. Are they sent in incinerators? Are they sent to other poorer countries, etc.? And then second, refining our alternatives on solutions, research on that, and what are emerging fall solutions. Third, what policies, infrastructure are needed to ensure inclusive and safe recovery of materials, especially when waste pickers are the front lines of collecting the materials. Third, capacity building and production, and knowledge sharing platforms and materials for members and key stakeholders. So we said we have to engage fast and now on media and policy engagement, but at the same time, we have to capacitate ourselves on these issues. And fourth, we have to continue doing stakeholder analysis and alignment building. There's so many opportunities to work with those watching mining, human rights, labor, and we have to say that these are how we see things in the region. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you. I hope this was informative.
Thank you so much, Maya. And lastly, we are going to invite Aline to present European perspectives on the EV battery issues.
Yes, hello, thank you. Is someone going to share the slides, please? Because I see some of the colleagues were supposed to do so had connection issue, could it be?
Let me screen share.
Thank you so much, June. So in the meantime, I just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Aline from Zero Waste Europe. And today I will walk you through the main insights for Europe. So I see that the presentation is coming, but I'll
The screen sharing is working, right?
Sorry?
The screen sharing is working.
Yes, it's working. Thank you, Dun. All right, so let's kickstart for Europe. So you can go maybe to the next slide, Dun, if possible. Thanks. Yes, great. So I think first kind of screenshot, which is useful for everyone to have in mind when talking about Europe and electric vehicle batteries. So information, like important information, is that Europe is one of the top 3 markets for electric vehicles, but at the same time, with really ambitious emission reduction targets for new vehicles, including what we called zero emission vehicles. So this acronym ZEV is a useful one to remember. Zero emission vehicles for new cars and van as of 2035. So that's like a big target that is coming up for Europe, but I will say a bit more about this in the next minutes. And also an important one to remember is that the EU has the world's first comprehensive battery regulation that has kind of got a lot of attention the last months. It was adopted really recently, so I'm happy also to do a deep dive in this afterwards. And then zooming in also on the right-hand side in our membership at Zero Waste Europe. So we have consulted our members, and I think in general, it's fair to say that electric vehicle battery topics are generally a little disconnected from members' work in Europe. But we have to say that for some members, and I see, for example, Amigos de la Tierra is here, hello, Adriana, is, for example, engaged in some work on reducing mineral demand and increasing circularity. So Adriana, I would invite you to I would invite you to share, for example, the study that you guys commissioned recently, because it's very interesting work. So I would say limited work related to that in Europe from our membership, but a big acknowledgement that is a key and important topic. So moving on to the next slide, and I will continue giving you a bit more background on Europe. So I think it's not a big surprise what I will say, but still useful, I guess, to remind everyone. But basically, lithium-ion batteries production for electric vehicles in Europe, there are new production facilities that have been announced. But of course, if we compare that to East Asian production, there is still some way to go to catch up with this. And currently, we are a major net importer of electric vehicle batteries in Europe. Going to the next slides and talking more maybe about the manufacturing angle, I think it's also useful to highlight one figure, which is that 10% of global battery manufacturing capacity is in Europe, and it's primarily in Hungary and Poland, and it's set to triple by 2030. And then as well, Europe has an estimated capacity to recycle about 200,000 metric tons of electric vehicles batteries, and also want to double this by 2025. So just some figures here to start with. And if we go to the next slide, I would like also to give you a bit of background more on the legislative side of things. Why? Well, because I think there have been some very important legislations adopted actually really recently, the last months, that are very important for this work, but also probably because I work on policy, so I'm a bit biased and I always like to highlight this. But in terms of framework and where we are at in Europe, the EU has a target to be climate neutral by 2050. So this is already like a big one. But if we look more in the details of zero emission vehicles, we want to like electrify our fleets, so cars and vans by 2035, so zero CO2 emission by then. And then there is also an intermediate target by 2030 of like 55% of CO2 emission reduction for new cars. So I think it's important to highlight this, because it's quite important in terms of direction. Lawmakers have been setting quite clearly the direction. But of course, you could ask, like, what does it mean to have binding targets? And I think here it's interesting to mention that, for example, for the first target relating to being climate neutral by 2050, that's related to member states. So that's binding on EU member states, and they can be taken to courts for that if they don't meet that goal. For the goals and targets related to zero emission vehicles, it is binding on the industry, so car makers, and there are automatic fines, which are quite high, via the Court of Justice. So just to say, the direction is clear, but now the how is also a big question, of course. So going to the next slides. Here, still on legislation related files. So I wanted to just give you an overview of basically legislations that are related to this subject today. Unfortunately, the slide is just too big and there are too many legislations related to what we're discussing. But I wanted to flag some. Especially the EU Battery Regulation and the CRMA, another acronym to say Critical Raw Material Act. So let me start with the Battery Regulation. So as I mentioned, it's like a very comprehensive regulation on battery regulation, and it includes mandatory requirements for batteries, targets on collection, treatment, and recycling. So the procedure is now completed for this regulation. But what is important to note is that there will be what we call secondary legislation. So the details of, for example, recycling targets within this regulation will be kind of detailed in those secondary legislations. So it is not done yet, let's say. And the ambition of the text will very much depend also on this secondary legislation. But I will dive a bit more in the battery regulation. But before that, I would also like to say a few words about the Critical Raw Material Act, which is a plan of Europe which aims to ensure that the EU becomes as independent as possible from third countries on the import of raw materials needed for battery production. So also a very important one to understand, and as you can see on the screen, there are some also really clear target in terms of how many EU to extract 10% of the necessary raw materials on its own soil by 2030. So these kind of targets are also detailed in the Critical Raw Material Act. So important to understand this umbrella kind of act. Then on the next slide, I will do a deep dive in the battery regulation. Yes, thanks. So here I wanted to, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the detail of the EU battery regulation, but I would like to highlight like few aspects that it entails. So firstly, it introduced a digital battery passport. So Dune already explained some aspect of the battery. So that would be by 2027, so coming up quite quickly. And this new battery passport would be accessible via QR codes and would contain information related to the battery model, but also specific to the individual battery. So that will be quite important. And in this regulation, you have really an annex that kind of explain what does this battery passport needs to include. As a second point, it also sets minimum recycled contents, so also quite detailed for each substances. While it does not oblige electric vehicle batteries to be used for second life after they are no longer usable in vehicles, it clearly facilitates facilitates that via different aspects in the regulation. So it is a bit the idea, well, not really mandatory, let's say. So it also introduced EPR, so extended producer responsibility to whoever placed the battery on the EU market. So quite an important one. And it set out also the minimum level of recovered material. We have produced a briefing that kind of summarize and explain this, that when you get the slides, you can also just click on the link if you are thirsty for more details. So now going to the next slides, please. Yes, so I will now conclude for us. So in Europe, I think our findings led us to the conclusion that electric vehicles and really a battery-focused approach to resource scarcity and extraction is very essential, but also could be seen as incomplete. because we all know that environmental and social impacts related to electric vehicles extend far beyond the battery themselves. So to give you an example, being a bit more concrete, I think rare earth can also be found in the headlights, for example, of a vehicle, of a car, but also in catalytic converter and other car components. So I think that's quite important to flag. But this aspect of being like important, essential to look at it, but incomplete is also especially true in the EU context, so the European Union context, because the European Union legislation works also in a very interconnected way. And for us, in order to be effective in terms of legislation advocacy, we really need to look at it in a holistic approach. So what do I mean with this? It means that we cannot only look at the battery regulation and the secondary legislation that will be coming up, because it will also be interlinked with, for example, other waste of electronic and electrical appliances that has a separate regulation for it. So for us, it's really the importance of looking at it in a more broader way in order to have effective impacts. And then in terms of what's important to understand, and if I would like you to keep maybe 2-3 points in mind, that would be firstly, like, to understand that this work really of like batteries and electric vehicles really is taking place under the umbrella of the Critical Raw Materials Act, which is a European attempt to reduce its dependency on critical materials from third countries. And that is really, and this approach is really set to be accelerated also with the next mandate. So as of September September this year. And at Zero Waste Europe, discussing with colleagues, I think that was clear for us that this strategy, the way we can work on this is, of course, to embed this work in our broader framework, which is really very much linked to sufficiency and therefore really called for, less cars on the road, but also reducing the size of cars and so on. But at the same time, I think it is also important that we acknowledge that in terms of our added value and the legislative opportunities, that it rather lies in maybe the circularity of things. So really looking more at maybe repair, reuse of batteries. The recycled content will also be like a very big, one coming up. So I think I will stop here so that we have enough time for question afterwards.
Great, thank you for your amazing presentation, Aline. Okay, so now we can move on to the Q&A part of the webinar. So we've already received some questions from my presentation until now. So let's try to answer them one by one. So I'll start for my part. So Lo Hyun from Zero Waste Europe posted this excellent question about what do you mean by appropriate recycling in the zero waste hierarchy for EV battery waste. So that's a great question. That's what we are trying to figure out at the moment. So appropriate recycling should have a set of criteria. So the toxicity issues should be cleared, and by recycling, the original value has to be recovered. So the recovery efficiency also matters, and the impact to the local communities nearby also matter, and the greenhouse gas emissions from the process. So there's multiple factors to be considered when we consider a recycling process appropriate and legitimate. So that's what we are working on now, and mainly we are trying to figure out what hydrometallurgy is, what it means in terms of sustainability, and also there's another method called direct recycling. So we are trying to figure out whether that has any hopes for battery recycling. At the moment, we are concerned that battery recycling is very challenging because of the difficulties in battery disassembly and also the problems associated with burning, the thermal technologies, and also the use of acidic solvents and the processing of the residual waste after the process. Yeah, so it remains to be seen, and we are going to share some more research in the future. Thank you for that question. And I think another question I got from Suzanne and also Jana were all related about the different types of batteries used in different vehicles, which I answered in the chat. And just point out a key point is that we are just surprised to see that the batteries are being manufactured in a million different ways. It's really hard to track how they are being built because the manufacturers are not standardized, right? So even for vehicles of a similar capacity, there can be lots of different chemical mixes and battery shapes and types. So we haven't really looked into the big vehicles like buses and trains yet, but we will be checking the details of that as well. And another point I wanted to make is that in the field visit that Mayang mentioned in her presentation in the Philippines, we noticed that for 2- and 3-wheelers, lead acid batteries were being used because of their cheap price rather than lithium-ion batteries. So it really varies by multiple factors, and it's very complex to understand the whole picture of the battery design and recyclability. All right, so Kenza, I don't think we have any questions for Kenza now. For Mayang, we got a question about guidelines, health guidelines for safe handling of EV battery waste. Mayang, do you have an answer for that?
No. What we are seeing, I can't pretend that I know, but there are guidelines for e-waste in general because the cell phones, the laptops are there for a long time already. So we're prepared for that. But for EV batteries, there's just no guidelines. But there are discussions there are provisions that we're seeing in industry-wide roadmaps on safe handling of safe recycling, disposal, formation of technical guidelines for this and that, but it never moves. It doesn't move as fast as the market grows. So that's the situation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Mayang. And as I mentioned, there's the Basel guidelines that are being built on non-lead acid batteries, which might have some health guidelines for safe handling of EV battery waste, but it's not centered around protection of waste speakers. So that's why we need to raise our voices to ensure that there's proper regulation and guidelines, as well as training and education to protect those who are being impacted. Okay, another question for Mayang is from Piotr. So I think the point of the question is that Mayang mentioned that there's lack of acknowledgement of light mobility vehicles like 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers because everything is a little bit kind of Western centric in the discussion on EV battery waste issues. But is it really better to use larger size vehicles because as zero waste community, we should not call for more bigger cars? So Mayang, do you have an answer for that?
I think I have responded to that in the chat. So we're not saying no to those kinds of smaller EVs, but we're just saying that those kinds of EVs are very problematic in Asia Pacific when they come here and nobody has the infrastructure for recycling. For example, they come in millions already in our markets, especially in Southeast Asia. But when we speak with waste pickers, when they recover the materials, nothing is actually valuable. The metals, they're not sellable. They're made of poor metals. I forgot what's the name of that metal sheet. They're actually very light. The battery is what they recover, but the prices are fluctuating. So that's the answer for in terms of economic value in the recycling. There's no value. There's poor value, poor economic value for those kinds of materials when we think of the zero waste. But in terms of how it is being used by the poor, of course, it has benefits. Because when we talk to communities and repair shops of EVs, many buy them because of high fuel prices. But what we're saying is that it's not the type of EVs, but the broader, how we address the broader problem of how do we decarbonize the public transport system. It's not EV as a bullet solution. It could be improve the entire public system, make people walk, probably improve the train system, the bike lanes, etc. It's not just EV. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayang. Does anybody else have an opinion to add?
Yeah, if I may, thank you very much, Maya, for this. Obviously, I agree, and this is obvious. We need parallel solutions that are much more beneficial for the whole of society and decarbonization, such as light mobility, walking, cycling. I just want to point out again, and it applies to many different presentations today. To decarbonize our economy, we also have to look at electrification of everything that can be electrified. Honestly, I'm a big proponent of that. But it's not to exchange one-to-one every combustion car to electric car. Now there must be a reduction, so sufficiency as well. But sometimes I heard in presentations that we are opposing EV, and actually nobody said almost that the internal combustion cars, they also have a huge social problems and value chain problems and lack of recycling and so on. So let's please compare also those two scenarios and not oppose EV like that, because I don't agree. Yeah.
Maybe I can jump in, Piotr. So I don't think this is what we mean, that we oppose electric vehicles. I think we rather come from a point that everyone was like really pushing for electrification. I think especially in Europe, there is a push also from NGOs, environmental organizations, to really push for electrification. Like the last years, without necessarily always also highlighting all the issues related to electrification. So maybe we took for granted that it was like a bit of a background for everyone that, of course, we are in favor of electrification, well, at least at Zero Waste Europe, but we need to also be careful at all the other issues that are coming with them. So of course, yeah, reducing in terms of like sufficiency, that we don't want to replace one-to-one, but like specifically looking at recycling, for example. What I observe in Europe, the discussion also with stakeholders, but also with NGO, is that many people are actually saying, well, actually, let's just push for electrification without being aware, for example, that there are huge issues relating to recycling of it. So I think that was rather the intention here, to also making sure that, yes, we push for electrification, but to what extent and what are the related issues. So sorry if that wasn't clear, and we take that on board for the next presentation that we have to do, and make sure that we set a bit the background for that.
Mayank,
Thank you. I appreciate. It's just
Right.
sometimes we have to clarify because then we are, you
Yeah.
know, all going in the direction of bashing without these nuances.
Right. And thank you for that comment. Actually, I agree that electrification is one of the. I think that's yeah. Electrification is important, but as we said in some regions, these are what we're seeing is just a shift from one source of energy to another when we don't see the process, what we're going from, who owns that, the electric grids, what source is it green already? How is it done? The shift from one form to another. There's a lot of just transition issues that we're saying that we're not prepared because of the fast shift that we are doing. The fast but necessary shift. And I agree, electrification is one, but that's not everything. It's not just low GHG emissions that we're should look into, but other social issues as well. And this is a very important, maybe we have to refine this in other spaces.
yes, and in the chat, Pinky made a great point about this, that we need to push toward accessible, affordable, and reliable public transport, which is, you know, in the waste hierarchy as the refuse and rethink part. So I just wanted to repeat that. And we have 2 questions remaining in the chat. So one is, have we seen any cases of mass dumping of used EV batteries? I don't think the answer is yes. Kenza might know. We can circle back to you after checking the details. Does anybody want to add about a case of mass dumping of EV batteries?
There are toxic landfills in China. So there's some photo essay on that. Actually, a lot of documentaries on EV cars that are on landfills in China. And there are cases where waste speakers, not massive dumping, but just irresponsible dumping, not yet dumping from other countries. We don't have documentation on that.
Right. Thank you, Maya. And lastly, I wanted to check the question about, where did it go? It was about how do we tackle this issue? How do we ensure that the growing EV market and regulatory frameworks integrate proper waste management systems to avoid another waste disposal problem? That's a great question. I think the first step can be a webinar like this, everyone gathering here to share knowledge and think about strategies and future plans. And GAIA is doing a lot of research involving some members, and we are rolling out some mini grant projects as well to do local investigation and grassroots organizing. And so stay tuned for future activities, and we really appreciate everyone spending time on this webinar and sharing thoughts and asking questions, and we look forward to having another opportunity like this as a follow-up.